If you've seen Indiana Jones or certain Veggie Tales, then you've seen depictions of the Ark of the Covenant, the holy structure God commanded Moses to build that contained the tablets of the law, the jars of manna, and Aaron's budded staff. Stories of the Ark have fascinated Christians, Jews, Muslims, and more for millennia, and every few years a new article will come up claiming to have found it. But what if I told you it's never truly been lost? What if I told you a small, ancient church in Ethiopia has had it since the time of Solomon? The writings of this influenced the modern world. Non-Chalcedonian Christians, Rastafarianism, the strength of Ethiopia, and colonialism have all been shaped by the echoes of the 14th century work, the Kebra Nagast, or the glory of the kings, the topic of today's video. One more brief little note before we get too far into the video. I frequently refer to ideas of Ethiopia, Ethiopians, they, Christians, collectives, Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. Obviously, this does not account for the entirety of any population. It's just the majority, and for a YouTube essay, video essay, survey kind of deal, it's a simpler way for me to expand on ideas that I'm not an expert in, so bear that in mind. Also, fair warning, there is some pretty horrific content in the Kebra Nagast itself that can be upsetting to viewers. So when I'm in those sections, just be aware that there are some graphic inclusions there. And I would also like to say I am primarily a religious historian, so though there are a lot of interesting things about politics, gendered politics especially, I don't dig into it, not because it's not important and interesting, but it's the same reason I don't get into military history. It just doesn't make sense to me in the same way. So anyway, thank you. So we'll start with a brief synopsis of the work and how it came to be. The Kebra Nagast was written in the 14th century. It was written in Ge'ez, the language of Ethiopia. It looks like this. I cannot, unfortunately, read it. So the translation I'm working with was done by the Englishman E.A. Wallace Budge in 1922 and updated in 1932. Translation is widely available, so many small presses republish it. This is the specific one that I have. The work itself was written largely to legitimize the rule of the Solomonic dynasty, which began in 1270 AD after the overthrow of the Zagwe dynasty, though it does claim to have been created and compiled earlier. So in the Kebra Nagast, the Solomonic kings claim descendants from the biblical king Solomon and the queen of the south, Makeda, or the queen of Sheba, Makeda in the story, through the former ruling dynasty of Axum. The Solomonic emperors ruled over 700 years from 1270 AD to September 12, 1974, after the deposition of Emperor Haile Selassie. There are still living claimants to the dynasty, though they are not in power. So what is this book that managed to shape and inspire politics, religion, and culture for 7 centuries? Let's jump in. So the Kebra Nagast begins with a brief history of the Christian Old Testament, or the Talmudic, or Pentateuch. So after confession of faith and confirmation that God made man in his divine kingly image, it focuses briefly on the Pentateuch to introduce the Ark of the Covenant as a seal of God's favor and his will. Now, though interesting, I'm going to skip these sections here. The majority of the Kebra Nagast focuses on the relationship between Queen Makeda, King Solomon, and their son Menelik I. It describes how Menelik came to be, his power, and how Ethiopia was blessed and chosen to hold the Ark of the Covenant beyond and over even Israel. Now, the final section includes various prophecies that, while also fascinating, are not the focus of this video. I highly encourage any interested viewers to pick up a copy, or online there are PDF versions of the older translation, which I believe is public domain. Either way, it's not terribly expensive, and I think it's worth reading. Now, it is important to establish what is and is not part of the story, as it is originally found in the Christian Old Testament. So, the Queen of the South appears to Solomon in 1 Kings, 3 Kingdoms, chapter 10, verses 1 through 13, and 2 Chronicles, chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. The text is largely unchanged between these two, so I'll be reading from 1 Kings / 3 Kingdoms. Why? Because it's first in the order of the Bible. Also, it was written by Saint Yedemiah, according to church tradition, who is my patron saint. So, Here's the account found in the Christian Old Testament of this interaction. I read from the Oxford University Press Revised Standard Edition from 1977. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a great retinue, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king which he could not explain to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings, which he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, the report was true which I heard in my own land of your affairs and your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpassed the report which I heard. Happy are your wives, happy are these your servants, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a very great amount of almug wood and precious stones. And the king made of the almug wood supports for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house lyres also and harps for the singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. And King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked besides what was given her by the bounty of King Solomon. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants. And that's it. It is the majority, but not even the entirety of that chapter. Like I said, the version in 2 Chronicles is very much the same without significant change between the two. But there's a lot missing. There's no interpersonal relationship between Solomon. The Queen of the South, the Queen of Sheba, is not even actually named. Now, tradition in Ethiopia names her Makeda, and that she comes from modern-day Ethiopia. So that short story is where this whole book comes from. You know, the Kebra Nagast expounds upon those ideas. So we're going to turn to the Kebra Nagast now. There are a few specific passages I will read. We'll talk a little bit about the political narratives and intentions of it at the time in the Middle Ages, and then finally we'll end, as we always do, in the modern era. So the story begins very similarly with a lot more details, but a merchant trader goes to the queen to report the splendor and beauty of Solomon, and she goes and travels with him. Now, an important refrain throughout this one that is actually, you know, it's referenced in the Old Testament story as well. Ethiopia, at the time, their kingdom is not lacking in splendor. It's a constant refrain throughout the work that they are equals to Solomon, if not greater, in wealth, in precious materials, and they have a difference in only one thing: wisdom. And now, in the story, of course, that wisdom of Solomon is attributed to the God of Israel, who would be the God of the Jews, and then later the Christians claim, you know, we claim to have the same deity. In Ethiopia, Christianized in the 4th century, therefore they're claiming this legacy. So it's wisdom that sends Queen Makeda to Solomon. And while there, she's deeply impressed. She finds, as is said in the story, that his wisdom is even better than she'd been told or could have expected. She hears his judgments and spends about 6 months with him before wishing to return to Ethiopia. And Solomon hopes to have sexual relations with her. And she's resistant, she's a virgin, and that's important to her idea as a ruler. It kind of comes through the text that that's important to her state as in rulership and as her identity as a person. So after, you know, discussing to leave and how it'll look, they have a beautiful banquet. In Solomon, it says again and again, in his wisdom feeds her very spicy and very salty foods. And then before they go to bed, after dinner, they have this conversation, making a vow, which I will read to you now. This is chapter 30 of the Kebra Nagast. And Solomon answered and said unto her, I swear that I will not take thee by force, but thou must swear to me that thou wilt not take by force anything that is in my house. And the queen laughed and said to him, Being a wise man, dost thou speak as a fool? Shall I steal anything, or shall I carry out of the house of the king that which the king hath not given me? Do not imagine that I have come hither through love of riches. Moreover, my own kingdom is as wealthy as thine, and there is nothing with which for that I lack. Assuredly, I have only come in quest of thy wisdom. So there's that piece that I was talking about, that it's wisdom that she's here for, not riches. Still, Solomon makes her swear. She swears. Then he tricks her, essentially. He sets up a situation for her to fail. She's so thirsty, the only bowl of water is placed in the middle. She's sleeping on one end of the hall, he's sleeping on the other end of the hall. He pretends to be asleep. She goes to drink some of the water, and he accuses her of breaking the vow and stealing. And so he walks up and, says, "How dare you?" And she says, "The oath broken by my drinking water." And the king said unto her, "Is there anything that thou hast seen under the heavens that is better than water?" And the queen said, "I have sinned against myself, and thou art free from my oath. But let me drink water for my thirst. Then Solomon said unto her, "Am I perchance free from the oath which thou hast made me swear?" And the queen said, "Be free from thy oath, only let me drink water." And he permitted her to drink water, and after she had drunk water, he worked his will with her, and they slept together. Now this is a pretty horrific passage. He, tricks her into sleeping with him. This, as I have said, is an important, a cultural and religious story. I will say it's not in the Bible traditionally, but it is considered, pretty equal to it, to Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. To be fair, in the Old Testament itself, Solomon is often overcome by desire for women to the point that it is his downfall and the loss of his wisdom. So it fits that narrative of who Solomon is in that conception, in that religious worldview. Now, after this takes place, Solomon sleeps, and he has a dream where a brilliant sun shines over Israel, and it says, "It tarried there for a while, it suddenly withdrew itself, and it flew away to the country of Ethiopia, and it shone there with exceedingly great brightness forever, for it willed to dwell there." And it continues that the sun leaves Israel, and the Israelites hate him, and that they lifted up their hands against him with staves and knived, and wished to extinguish the sun, and they cast darkness upon the whole world, and then destroyed his light, and cast themselves upon him, and they set a guard over his tomb wherein they had cast him. And so this is, supposed to be an allusion to Jesus of Nazareth. "And he came forth where they did not look for him, and illumined the whole world, more especially the first sea and the last sea, Ethiopia and Rome." Rome, in this case, when it was written, they're referring to Constantinople, or New Rome. "And he paid no heed whatsoever to Israel, and he ascended his former throne." So this is essentially justification of why the ark would be taken in the story from Israel, and then also of the perceived disfavor of the nation of Israel. At the time this was written in the 14th century, there were complicated relationships between people of Abrahamic faith, and Jews were often in difficult positions depending on where they were living. This is referring to the idea that Christianity was not accepted by the Jews and then was given to the Gentiles. First, it names Ethiopia, who, according to the story, were faithful from the time of King Solomon onward. And then, of course, in the book of Acts, one of the first Christians is a Ethiopian man stopped on the road who was baptized. And then Constantinople being the other light of the church. So this is later shown in the story. The firstborn of King Solomon is Menelik I. He returns and asks favor from his father. His mother had given him a ring, Solomon had given his mother a ring in order that when he comes, he might be known by Solomon to be his son. However, when he gets there, they look so much alike that everybody is like, there he is. That's the king. And to the point that they get the king and they're like, "How are you in two places at once?" And he's like, "I'm not, but that's my son." And he's like, "Yep, look at my ring." He's like, "I don't need no ring. I can tell you're my son." So he asks for his blessing. Solomon wants Menelik to stay with him in the story to rule from Israel as the king of Israel and continue his line there. However, he refuses. He says he promised his mother already and that he must return to Ethiopia. He begs for but a covering of the Ark of the Covenant to take back. That is, people might be shown something holy and to have favor with God. After a lot of debating, Solomon agrees. He gives his blessing to Menelik and declares that he won't just have a piece of the covering, but the whole covering itself. And then he also says, as my firstborn is going to Ethiopia, so too will the firstborn of all of my advisors. So in the kingdom, there's this great call for all the firstborn sons of the leading families to go establish a kingdom in Ethiopia and rule, with the favor of the God of Israel. Now this continues. These firstborn sons are not terribly happy with the king to, be sent out of their homeland and their inheritance to a place they've never been because he said so. So they come up with a plan that does not involve Menelik. He's not aware of the plan to steal the Ark of the Covenant. Now you might be thinking, that's probably a bad idea, right? Like, you've seen Indiana Jones. It doesn't go well when you just take it. However, don't worry, because the angel of the Lord appeared again to Azarias and stood up above him like a pillar of fire, and he filled the house with his strong light. So basically, it is very clear in the story that it is ordained by God, that it is not rambunctiousness amongst these firstborn sons, that they're choosing to steal away this holy artifact, but they have this plan, and it is allowed by God. And it continues, the tabernacle of the law of God, it was taken away by them forthwith in the twinkling of an eye, the angel of the Lord being present and directing. And had it not been that God willed it, Zion could not have been taken away forthwith. So Zion referring to the Ark of the Covenant, meaning that it belongs in Ethiopia because it was given to God, showing that the sun now shines over Ethiopia as it had shone over Israel. When that happened, before finding out that the ark was taken, Solomon says, "Woe is me, for my glory hath departed, and the crown of my splendor hath fallen, and my belly is burned up, because this my son hath departed, and the majesty of my city, and the freemen, the children of my might, are removed. From this moment our glory hath passed away, and our kingdom hath been carried off unto a strange people, who know not God, even as the prophet saith, the people who have not sought me have found me." And he kind of continues on. He says that as my father, meaning David, and my father prophesied concerning them, saying, Ethiopia shall bow before him, and his enemies shall eat the dust. In another place he says, Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands to God, and he shall receive her with honor, and the kings of the earth shall praise God. So it kind of continues that, this very, very intentional refrain of, we are doomed now because of what we've done. God has now elected Ethiopia as our successors to be the chosen people of God. Now, there are interesting interpretations in those Psalms and in some of the translation and the language and how they're used. I won't get into all the theology of that here, but needless to say, for the purpose of this story, it is very much justifying the right to rule and the power of the Solomonic kings of the 14th century. Now, it kind of finishes this big section. They find out that it's taken. Solomon rushes with a great host. They go to Egypt, and they're like, hey, he's like, hey, have you seen a guy who looks a lot like me with a very, very important religious thing, maybe doing miracles? And they're like, yeah, he's gone. No, he just traveled like it was nothing. There's references to like airships and like traveling in the blink of an eye, and Solomon could not catch him. And then, he kind of has this conversation with the Spirit of the Lord, and it's like, oh, woe is us, like we're doomed forever. And he's like, well, at least it's your son. I'm being a little blasé about it. But at the end, Solomon returns recognizing that his dream has come true and that the light of Israel has departed to now shine over Ethiopia rather than over his kingdom. So then after that, the story kind of goes on to various prophecies, like I mentioned at the beginning. I'm not going to get into those here, but we're going to talk a little bit now about the political narratives of this book at the time and some of the very blatant attempts it makes at justifying the rule of the Solomonic kings. It obviously references things that happened in the ancient past, but the work was written around the 14th century, so it reveals more about what the Solomonic kings of the Middle Ages wanted out of their people or thought they needed to justify in their rulership. There's more in here. It's kind of the entire point of the work. So I'm just picking a few sections that are particularly interesting. So let's get into it. So first in chapter 28, there's the conversion, where the queen, after being impressed by the wisdom of Solomon, says, "From this moment I will not worship the sun, but will worship the creator of the sun, the God of Israel, and the tabernacle of the God of Israel shall be unto me my lady, and unto my seed after me, and unto all kingdoms that are under my dominion. And because of this I have found favor before thee, and before the God of Israel my creator, who hath brought me unto thee, and hath made me to hear thy voice, and has shown me thy face, and has made me to understand thy commandments." Obviously, this is a departure from a vague sort of paganism. The sun and the moon are obviously representing deities that are now no longer to be worshipped. There's a common theme in Christianization of turning from the worship of the created things to the creator of those things. So this is justification in the Middle Ages that Ethiopia has had and held this truth for a very long time, showing them to be a dynasty of Christian thought and unity. Later in chapter 33, this is after having the interaction where Solomon tricks and then has sex with the queen, where she says, the book says, "Now there was a law in the country of Ethiopia that only a woman should reign, and that she must be a virgin, who had never known man. But the queen said to Solomon, Henceforth a man who is of thy seed shall reign, and a woman shall never more reign. Only the seed of thine shall reign, and his seed after him, from generation to generation." So this is a very key claim to the dynasty that the Solomonic kings are both claiming and trying to create. So as I mentioned briefly in the intro, the Solomonic kings disrupted the rule of the Zagwe dynasty and claimed to be related to Axum, who ruled previously. Their claim is that not only are they related to the kings of Axum, but they are exclusively related to them, and that these kings were direct descendants of Solomon. Interestingly, the Zagwe dynasty claimed to be descendants of Moses. So there were these kind of foundations, but there was this idea that they were Semitic in Ethiopia, regardless of how it was interpreted, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the modern section, kind of ideas of like Ethiopian exceptionalism. But here, it is that a woman is not allowed or supposed to rule, despite that having once been the case. It is now that only men are eligible to rule, and specifically that only men from this line descending from King Solomon are eligible to be rulers. This is obviously a shift, not just in the gendered politics of the Middle Ages, which now clearly show that men are claiming the right to be exclusive rulers, but also in the idea that this dynasty has existed for nearly millennia, even at that point, when it is first really referenced here in the Kebra Nagast and by the Solomonic kings. Chapter 41 has the blessings of kings and blessings from Solomon to his son and the ideas of what a king needs to be. So in some ways this is a diatribe against previous rulers who did not match this description because they were not descendants of Solomon, but it is also in a way a declaration of how these kings ought to rule in order to be considered just or to be considered favored by God. Now, chapter 44 is titled in this edition, "How it is not a seemly thing to revile the king." It is probably the least subtle. I won't read the whole thing, but it begins, "Now it is not a seemly thing to revile the king, for he is the anointed of God. It is neither seemly nor good. If he doeth that which is good, he will not suffer loss in 3 kingdoms. So first, God shall overthrow his enemy. Second, God shall make him reign with him with his righteousness, and shall make him to sit on the right hand of his glory. Thirdly, God shall make him to reign upon the earth with glory and joy." So if you respect the king and the king respects God, everything works. You have a blessed, beautiful kingdom. If you start to disrespect the king, you start to take yourself out of that, and then hopefully the king doesn't further stray from it, but it's possible that you both lose the favor by that disobedience and kind of that inversion of how things are supposed to go. The message here is being very clear. If you want all those blessings that we just talked about, all those good things that I as the king can give you, you have to respect me and treat me like a king, and don't doubt that my authority comes from God. Similar blessings can be found in chapter 49. And then a kind of disparate interaction in 64. Chapter 64 provides more insight into the biblical idea that Pharaoh turned from the God of Israel because one of his wives, the daughter of Pharaoh from Egypt, turned to the Egyptian gods, and how he lost his wisdom in favor of God. This is recounted here. And again, I won't read that whole section, but essentially the idea there is saying that if it's furthering the idea that if this is not held to the standard that it should be, if kings aren't placing God above them, and if the people aren't treating kings as divinely chosen agents of the God of Israel, then favor will be taken away from the land of Ethiopia, as even happened to King Solomon, who allowed himself to be swayed by worldly things to the point that he lost his favor. He lost the Ark of the Covenant, and then later after that he even lost his wisdom, which is what made him so attractive to Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia in the first place. Now, like I said, this is a fairly brief kind of summary and quick review through some of what can be found in the Kebra Nagast. We're going to go into some of the modern importances of this work. There's more that I would love to discuss in a longer video, or if I had more time about, the idea of the Middle Ages and Christianization and Chalcedonian versus non-Chalcedonian Christianity, and even, ideas of like this hidden Christian kingdom in Ethiopia, and all these influences that are in many ways informed by or represented by this book. So I, again, highly encourage you to check it out and read it for yourself. But now we'll get into the modern history. So at the risk of, being ahistorical, there are questions of how or why does this book from the 14th century that supposedly tells a story from around 900 BC relate to the modern era. Now, it definitely does, I promise. It does, and I can prove it. That's most of the rest of this video. But you might be asking yourself, why does it matter? What are we studying? Now, to answer that question, I have a quote from, this is the quote as it is directed in the book, which I will talk about the source in a minute. But the quote is from His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia, King of Kings, elect of God, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. So here's what he says in this source. The American people can make a significant contribution to guaranteeing that a deep and abiding friendship exists between Africa and the United States of America. Learn more about us, learn to understand our backgrounds, our cultures and traditions, our strengths and weaknesses. Learn to appreciate our desires and hopes, our problems, our fears. If we truly know one another, a solid and firm basis will exist for the maintenance of the friendly relationships between the African and the American peoples, which, we are convinced, both so ardently desire. You may be assured that there will be no failure in the warm and brotherly response from our side. Now that comes from a book, it's called The Queen of Sheba's Heirs by Edith Lord, who is a former advisor to, on education to Emperor Haile Selassie. So she's obviously got a little bit of a bias, a little bit of a vested interest. It is a very interesting book. It starts with a quiz on the customs, cultures, and beliefs of Ethiopia, so you can see how well you know. I didn't do great. I'm not gonna lie, I did not do great, but the book kind of exists to bridge the gap, and so that's what that quote comes from. Now, obviously you don't have to be limited to America to watch this. YouTube very wonderfully gives these opportunities to arise from everywhere, but it is a sort of history that we're not as familiar with in the West, very generally speaking. So a few things that I noticed. Every book that I picked up from my university library on modern Ethiopia has an introduction that says something along the line. It mentions a few things. It mentions the origin of the name Ethiopia from Greek, which means burnt faces, and how that became adopted, especially during. Well, we'll get into that. But so it has the origins of the term Ethiopia, and then it references the Kebra Nagast in the perceived descent from Solomon, all the way up until 1974 with the deposition of Emperor Selassie. So this is like a very clear foundation to how Ethiopia and Ethiopian people view and have viewed themselves for about at least a millennia. So this idea relates to a lot of different topics in modernity because it has been important to the people of Ethiopia who we talk about in these modern interactions. Now, some of what we'll talk about will be colonialism, or more specifically, anti-colonialism. There is a very well-known fact that Ethiopia is one of only 2 countries in Africa to have not been colonized. And so you have to be careful talking about these things that, you know, Ethiopia, even though I'm discussing it in this modern context, will in some ways come up through colonialism or interactions with European colonial powers. Even if it's funny to make fun of Italy for failing, it isn't the point that these countries or people should only come into the historical light when interacting with European or Western powers. Doesn't mean you shouldn't teach colonialism, obviously, but it does mean that it can't be the only thing. Like, Ethiopia should not exist in a course on colonialism, and then they, you know, defeat Italy a couple of times, and then you move on, right? Because there is obviously its own history going back thousands and thousands of years. So that's my kind of brief, not warning, but my brief little note that though I will be discussing aspects of colonialism, it's because it relates to the history we've discussed, it relates to the Kebra Nagast, and my own limited knowledge of modern African history. It should not be seen or viewed as either the most important, and certainly not the only points of history for Ethiopia and Ethiopian people. Right. Now, as we jump into the modern era, I thought it would be fitting to start with Emperor Menelik II, who reigned as the king of Shawa from 866 to 899 AD, and then as emperor of Ethiopia from 889 to 913. Not only does Menelik II bear the name as his assumed mythical predecessor, the legendary Menelik I, from the Kebra Nagast that we've just been talking about, but his reign also represented a shift in Ethiopian history as the country pushed for modernization. So it's a very interesting time in the history of Ethiopia with a lot of very famous examples that even a common viewer might be familiar with. So, the name first. It is a clear connection to Menelik I and his legacy. Menelik II, not his birth name, his imperial title, likely chose this to justify his rule and make clear the connection between the Solomonic kings, which would represent nearly 3,000 years of continuous rule if one believed the Kebra Nagast. So the use of the name Menelik shows a continued reliance on the claims of the Solomonic kings to their mythological foundation, but it also represents a promise. As I mentioned in the Kebra Nagast, you get some of the ideals of rulership. I didn't go into the specifics there, but some of those ideals that are talked about are, you know, the blessings that would be bestowed upon a righteous and worthy king and upon his followers. So these are things like, you know, better trade, flourishing culture, flourishing arts and sciences, better food, crops, abilities, strength in warfare. These kinds of things that like a good king would provide and would have provided divinely. So by claiming the name Menelik II, he is in some way affirming or claiming to be part of that same truth and tradition. So it is a promise in many ways. The infamous Berlin Conference had occurred just 5 years before Menelik came to power as emperor in 1894. So the emperor would have been aware of his precarious position as one of the last independent nation states in Africa. Seeking to increase trade and secure the position of the nation abroad seemed to be one tactic, which includes traditional gifts of friendship to the United States. So you get trade in this form of diplomacy. Not only that, but there is also, as we shall see, warfare. First, diplomacy. So the Treaty of Wuchale was signed May 2nd, 1889 between authorities acting on behalf of Italy and Ethiopia. It was ostensibly for better trade and kind of the recognition of friendship between the two nations. The treaty intended to allow Italian rule in Eritrea, a neighboring province to Ethiopia. The intent of the treaty shows that the Ethiopian emperor was working in a way to confirm what he believed, or at least claimed to believe, were the best interests of his people, thus fulfilling the godly imperial duty that we've been talking about during this video. Now, you may notice that I focus on words like intent or ideals of the treaty. It did not last long. Italy famously intentionally manipulated the language in their version of the treaty. It was recorded in both Italian and in Ge'ez, to take more control of Ethiopia and leave room for further colonial efforts. So they basically blurred the lines and referred to Ethiopia as a protectorate. You know, they tried to pull a fast one. When this was discovered, Ethiopia withdrew support, and Menelik II denounced the treaty in 1893, which led to war shortly after. Italy initiated the war by invading from their territory in Eritrea, and Menelik II called his people to arms, famously saying, "Now an enemy that intends to destroy our homeland and change our religion has come crossing our God-given frontiers. Now with the help of God I will not allow him to have my country. You, my countrymen, I have never knowingly hurt you, nor have you hurt me. Help me, those of you with zeal and willpower, and those who do not have the zeal for the sake of your wives and your religion, help me with your prayers." Now this quote represents all of the ideals from the Kebra Nagast I have discussed here. The God-given right to rule, to lead, to flourish. The role of the king and the mutual benefits offered between the ruler and the ruled as a divinely sanctioned apparatus. It's not just soldiers, but prayers. And you get a very real sense that though it'd be better to be a soldier and to pray, at least praying is a legitimately helpful piece of this puzzle. Now, if I'm not a modern historian, I am even less of a military historian, to say nothing of modern military history. So rather than going into specific details of the war or battle, I'll briefly analyze and connect a primary source to the final battle, the Battle of Adwa. Now, the First Italian-Ethiopian War was fought from January 1895 to October 1896, and the Battle of Adwa was fought on March 1st, 1896. So this is the painting I have, hopefully imposed on the screen now. This painting came from around half a century later in the 1940s, shortly after the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, brief Italian occupation, and the expulsion of colonial forces. The artist is unknown. So some of the things you'll notice while looking at this painting is the very clear difference between Ethiopia and Italy. Italy are very obviously kind of the faceless, aggressive bad guys who are just kind of a mob. But you do get the sense that there's military power. Now this is a refrain seen throughout history where the military power of the enemy after defeat is recognized not necessarily as a form of respect sometimes, but more often it is to show that the opposing army, in this case the Ethiopians, the people who protected their homeland, were strong and justified because they defeated a strong army. Now of course it's not only that. There's a depiction of St. George, and he's ringed in a halo, but the halo is the traditional colors of the Ethiopian flag, rather than the typical halo you see surrounding his head. This kind of proves that not only are they divinely led, but they are also, continuing to have favor with God, and Ethiopia represents something unique and special about their form of Christianity. You also notice, the strength of the Ethiopian fighters, and they're depicted in, colors and, ceremonial dress. You see the emperor, you see the empress. There's these figures who you can tell are important and carry a certain weight behind them. I also think it's interesting that as a Christian nation who has been Christian for, centuries at this point, and claims to have been even longer followers of the God of Israel, a lot of the arguments that colonists like to make about like Christianizing or educating or civilizing and those other kind of, very racist stand-ins for what they were doing or what they were trying to do, whether or not what colonists believed what and to what extent they, truly believed they were helping is debatable. But in the case of Ethiopia, that argument could not really be made because Ethiopians would say we're already Christian. We have been. We have a clearer idea of what Christianity is than you do, in fact. Now, there were attempts at Catholic intervention in the area that worked for a little while, but ultimately failed. And a lot of that is Ethiopia has a very firm identity of who and what they are in terms of their faith and their culture. A lot of this is informed by things like the Kebra Nagast, in the belief that Ethiopia has and has had a unique claim to the spiritual legitimacy and succession of King Solomon, and therefore the God of Israel and Christianity. To the point that in Ethiopia today, they firmly, fully believe that they have the Ark of the Covenant. I'll see if I can put up a video. I'll do so now, but they're often by news sources, and even so, it's not the actual Ark that you'll see on video. That's very well protected and a very fascinating sort of rituals and the people who guard it. But they do believe that they have it, and they believe that it is what they have had since the time of King Solomon. So this is one way in which the Kebra Nagast and this idea of like Ethiopian exceptionalism, they're Semitic people who are descended from Solomon, who have the legacy of kings who were one of the four great kingdoms mentioned, Axum was. This idea that they're above and beyond other not only places in Africa, but also in Europe and in the rest of the West and in the rest of the world, because they were given the sun. Now again, I'm not an art historian, so there's more to this piece, and there's absolutely things that I missed and more details that can be found in it. I highly recommend spending some time seeing it online and checking it out for yourself. Now, all that to say, the point of this whole exercise is to show the power and the glory of kings. It's to show that the image of an emperor, even at this time, in the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, still retained this language of a godly ruler who was, by divine inspiration, set to lead and defend his people. This would continue until the 70s, when the final emperor Haile Selassie was deposed in 1974. But before we get there, we'll say, Menelik II is an important and highly lauded figure. Now, I've presented a few excerpts here to highlight his legacy from the viewpoint of an emperor who ruled well. Throwing out the Italians, seeking to make international treaties and justify their space. This is not a complete picture, as history is full of nuance and complexities. Menelik II was himself a conqueror. His armies were known to carry out atrocities against civilians and soldiers alike. This brief video has not focused on these things, not because they do not matter, but because they did not fit neatly into the narrative of kings that I have chosen to tell. Now remember that all of history is a narrative, and every historian is an interpreter. Though I would not mislead intentionally, and therefore include this note, I implore you all to recognize that bias exists everywhere. The stories we choose to tell, how we choose to tell them, there's an unconscious reality of who we are that shapes all of these things. In choosing to study a book from the Middle Ages, because I think it's fascinating and has a little bit of history and theology, and culture and politics all mixed into it, I ended up talking about this person from the modern era who I'm not terribly familiar with. I present him as a hero, defending his people by divine right of God, but to the people who had atrocities carried out against them in the name of this emperor, he represents something very differently. Recognizing those parallels are both important and necessary for the field of history. Now, there are a few more broad examples from the modern era, for example, the former emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. Now, of course, even the Emperor Haile Selassie was from this same line of Solomonic kings, and like I said, it was 1974 that he was deposed. There are still claimants to that line living today, even though they don't rule in power. But the references, in his title, like what I read in that quote, the King of Kings, the Lion of Judah, you even see that on the imperial Ethiopian flag. There's this language that there is something unique and special about Ethiopia amongst all nations. And that is part of why it became a religious in its own right with Rastafarianism. Ras Tafari being king, and then Tafari is another name of the emperor Haile Selassie, who is viewed in that religion as either divine or divine spokesman. And you see in people like Marcus Garvey, Rastafarianism, Bob Marley, these echoes of an exceptionalism, the desire to see an Africa unconquered and untouched by modern European colonial powers. And it's not all myth, obviously. Like, Ethiopia was truly unconquered and a force to be reckoned with for centuries and centuries. Now, having the Ark of the Covenant and being descendants from King Solomon is probably almost definitely mythological, but that hasn't changed the effect it's had on cultural representations and ideas about Ethiopia and what Ethiopia is. And then in conversations of Pan-Africanism, especially in the 60s and 70s, Ethiopia became kind of a beacon of this idealized form of what Africa is when it has not been raped and spoiled by colonial intervention for centuries. Now, there are some potentially problematic aspects of this. I have heard similar ideas, just commonly, popularly represented, that Ethiopia is not just a height or an ideal, it is actually above other places in Africa, and of course, that is problematic. So even, when you're studying these things, you have to be careful that there's nuance to every story. But ultimately, what we see in Ethiopia is a kingdom that has existed for centuries. Even if you only date back to Axum, it's been almost 2,000 years since the formation of Axum. As a kingdom, in the rule that it had and the majesty and grandeur. So when you look at it, you have to look at these cultural elements. Now, this book may have been written in the 14th century to justify the rules of kings in the 14th century, but it never really went away. It continued to inform the culture, religion, and politics of Ethiopia, of non-Chalcedonian Christians, and therefore their interactions with the wider world. There are numerous examples that could be found about interactions with Islam and the caliphates. I mean, even Muhammad came to Ethiopia and is recorded as having found refuge and safety there, and then saying, do not go to war against these people who have helped us. That at varying points that was or was not true, depending on the caliphate and the caliph. Medieval stories about, Prester John and these mythical kingdoms in Africa of ancient and advanced Christians likely come from ideas of Ethiopia, a kingdom that, because of various factors, was kind of excluded from the Mediterranean and the European trade networks with other Western Christians, and developed its own identity and became, or continued to be, leaders of both themselves and the surrounding areas. So you see echoes of the Kebra Nagast throughout history, to the point that in the modern day it is still considered by some to be a holy book, to the point that you get this idea of a rallying cry, that Ethiopia has been chosen by God. And there are absolutely people in the world who truly believe that. And then you even have secularists who don't, believe in necessarily divine inspiration or divine selection as the chosen people of God, but who do nonetheless believe that Ethiopia is somehow set apart, that because of their great history and because of their culture and their learning and because of the way they have continued to exist despite outside forces, Ethiopia represents what a powerful and enduring kingdom should be. Now, I did not find much historical evidence of scholars using the Kebra Nagast as more as a footnote. As I said, they are often included in the introduction sections of books in reference as a point of history because it's so culturally ingrained to the fabric that it's hard to point out specifics of where it comes up. That being said, I don't think any of these claims are too broad, especially about the modern era. Obviously, Menelik I was being referred to by Menelik II. That's a reasonable claim. But beyond that, the imperial majesty, the right to rule, and the religious independence that makes Ethiopia throughout the centuries believe and refer to itself as a unique and important power with special divine providence continues to today. So I hope that by briefly analyzing this work from centuries and centuries ago, and then a battle from a couple centuries ago, and talking a little bit about a guy from, 60 years ago, you get some idea of how these things all inform each other, about how ancient history is at a time of its creation modern, and then is carried with it throughout time to leave a legacy when the work is as truly important as has been the Kebra Nagast. Thank you. I've had the pleasure to work with Dr. Caitlin Monroe at the University of Northern Colorado. I am by no means an expert in Africa or even in modern history, let alone modern African history. So I encourage and hope for any corrections on glaring mistakes or additions in the comments, but of course keep it civil. Thank you for taking the time, and I hope that you've learned more both about this rather somewhat in the West obscure text from the Middle Ages, and about the culture and place of Ethiopia today. So now, like I said, we'll be talking about some of the